Welcome to the Reading for Wellbeing podcast. I'm your host, Professor Pozzulo. Today I'm talking with Dr. Kaitlyn Regehr, author of Smartphone Nation, Why We're All Addicted to Our Screens and What You and Your Family Can Do About It. Welcome, Dr. Regehr. Great to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start talking about Smartphone Nation, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in researching smartphones and what's happening behind the screen?
So I'm now at University College London. I work on a program called Digital Humanities at UCL. And you can probably tell from my accent, I am a Canadian. I grew up in Toronto, and I grew up with, mental health professionals as parents. My dad is a clink shrink, a forensic psychiatrist, who worked on cases like the Bernardo case. And I often like to say that I basically took on the family business, but brought it into the 21st century. So instead of being a mental health professional, I look at how technology functions. I look at how these technological processes work and what they actually are doing to us, but not only what they're doing to us, but actually how we can take greater control over these processes, how we can push back against these addictive algorithmic processes so that we can be much more intentional about our usage. And so in many ways, I like to say that I got into this because I'm just carrying on the work of my family into the digital domain.
Great. Such a fantastic book. National bestseller. I would say it's essential reading for anyone who uses a screen. And I think it's about 94% of Canadians use a screen in some format. Such an eye-opener for me. I mean, I don't necessarily consider myself a tech person, but obviously I use the internet. Can you talk a little bit about how tech companies control our screen time, how they do it and why they do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I always start with the premise that almost everything we consume is regulated. By that, I mean the food we eat, the medication we take, the cars we drive. We're pretty used to consumer protections being in place. In fact, we're so used to it, we tend to assume that they are always in place. And what I really want people to understand is that we do not have those same consumer protections in the digital space. And in this book, I suggest that one of the key reasons for that is that we're not actually the consumers of tech. We are the product. And more specifically, our time and attention is the product which is being sold to advertisers. And what my team at UCL and I do is look at the way in which through this attention economy, or what Nick Cernak refers to as the algorithmic economy, hate, harm, and disinformation can be prioritized or can flourish because it's more attention grabbing. Because things that hook in to our insecurities, things that elicit an emotive response, will often hold us there just that little bit longer. And it's that extra time, that extra engagement that advertisers are paying for. And so what I want people to become really cognizant of is that their time and attention is money. Quite literally, it's being sold. And so that when we sit and we doom scroll and we just consume whatever is algorithmically fed to us, that is not necessarily the things that are good for us, or they might not even be the things that we really want to see, but rather they are being fed to us in order to hold our attention, to poach our attention as long as possible. And so when we talk about screen time, when we talk about engaging in screens, it's really important that we start to distinguish, our time spent on the algorithmically driven platforms that are built to suck us in, and how that's quite different from sitting down and making conscious choices on regulated spaces, about perhaps films, about if you actually make a choice to read a book on a screen. Those are much more intentional choices. So how do we move more towards intentional, engaged, active choices and away from us being passive products?
Wow. So tell me some strategies. What can we do about this?
So I think the first thing is starting to be really honest with ourselves about what our digital diet is. And this is about us as individuals, as adults. This is before we even start talking about our children. I tend to like to use something called a walkthrough method, which is actually a research method that we use generally with children and teenagers. It's when we get them to open up their screens and walk through a normative period of usage. And I think we should all be doing this. I think that you should sit down with your partner and scroll through a period of usage. That might sound super cringy. And if it does, it's worth questioning why that is. And it's understandable if that feels uncomfortable, because these are hyper personalized forms of viewing. They say a lot about us. They say a lot about our fears and our anxieties, these feeds. But it's important to realize that this is different than sitting together as a family watching a television show. This is a very different form of viewing. If you scroll through your normative period of usage and your partner says to you, you're getting a lot of ads for plastic surgery, is that the best thing for you? Or if they say, wow, you're getting a lot of images of kitchens that we can't afford, it's worth considering if that's the best thing for you. And then you decide. You decide what you want more of and what you want less of. And you actively start to search for the things you want and quickly move past the things you don't. So you become much more active in those choices.
Yeah, amazing. So you're saying that we can actually take some control back about what is fed to us.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that's even a question is a terrifying thought, because if we think about that in the offline world, you would never just consume everything that is fed to you. You wouldn't. You make choices. You make choices all the time, because these are the healthy decisions that we make for ourselves. And I think I really want to encourage people to think about their digital consumption in the same way that they think about their food consumption, which is we make choices. And yeah, sometimes they're not the good choices. Sometimes we, eat a tub of ice cream, but at least we know that that was a choice that we made. And I think it's reminding everyone that there are choices to be made here. Just as, when we put kids in front of screens, we're also making an active choice in order to do that too. So you are active in this. You have personal agency in this, and it should be utilized.
Amazing. Do you have any strategies for detecting sort of misinformation and disinformation? Because that seems quite prevalent nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the BBC's Teen Summit yesterday, and we were speaking with a whole bunch of teenagers from the north of England. And one of them said, I'm 50-50 on whether the moon landing was real. And another started talking about Charlie Kirk and talked about how This is the right-wing activist in the US who was recently shot. And they said, I think it was staged because of the angle of the way the bullet hit his neck. And essentially, what these young people were revealing was that they were consuming huge amounts of disinformation. They were microdosing. It's not one post one time, but it is the cumulative effect of all of these posts, which start to normalize a certain belief. And that is not unique to teenagers. That is something that can happen to us all. And that is something that we all need to be aware of. So how do we become aware of that? I think there's two parts of this conversation. One is, how do we become aware of misinformation? And the other is, how do we talk to people in our lives if we believe that they are consuming misinformation? So in terms of, thinking about misinformation and our own consumption, the best thing we can do is try to get our information from multiple sources. So you're not just consuming your news from your own personal feed, which is algorithmically offered to you and is going to be biased. It exists on something that Eli Prezer refers to as the U loop. Okay. We want to kind of move away from that and try and be getting our information from different sources and different perspectives. We also want to, be aware of everything that's actually around the information. So if it looks like things are written in different fonts, if you can look for street signs, do they actually look in an image? Do they actually look like they're where they're supposed to be? I also think we can use tools. There's a website called siteengine.com where if you think that an image might be AI or might be fake, you can actually put the image into siteengine.com and it will tell you how likely it is to be fake. So we just need to become, much more critical of what we are consuming, because these are not regulated spaces like if you were watching the news on the television or if you were reading the newspaper. And it's really important to always be cognizant of that. The other part of this discussion is, what do you do if someone you love is in an echo chamber, seems to be consuming misinformation, seems to be indulging in some kind of conspiracy theory, or is just becoming, super, super narrow in their thinking? What do we do about this? And it is not unique to any of your listeners. There will be people across the country who are experiencing this to greater or lesser extents in their home and at their Thanksgiving dinner table, right? It is playing out in different ways across the country. What I like to say is, instead of debating your loved one on the minutia of the issue, the detail of the issue, try and take a step back and actually start to talk about the technical processes that are at play that are driving them down this increasingly narrow viewpoint. And so then, instead of you being in debate with each other about the issue, you actually start to talk about the fact that there are greater powers at play, there is technology at play, that you as a family can actually combat together. So we try and bring the conversation into a space of togetherness against these unethical technological processes, instead of being a combative space against the individual issue at hand.
Great strategy. Would you say that there's particular groups that are maybe a little bit more vulnerable to tech companies and the algorithms, or are we all potentially vulnerable to this?
So I think it depends on what we mean by vulnerability. Definitely, teenagers and young people are on the sharp edge of this knife when it comes to issues of poor mental health, anxiety and depression. And also, notably sleep. And if you want to kind of look at some conclusive data on the impact of social media, sleep is actually one of the things that we can point to quite clearly as being impacted by social media usage. And, the Children's Commissioner in England has just come out to say screens should not be in the bedroom as a result of that, because kids are sleeping less, and that's not a good thing. I think what's reported upon less often is the impact that this tends to have on older generations. And I think it's important to think about that both as they can be, vulnerable to issues of fraud, and financial manipulation, but also that if you are retired, if you do have the time to spend a lot of hours in the digital space, that's not necessarily a good thing for you. And in this type of discussion, I think it's worth noting that this is a population who grew up with a very different relationship to the phone, with a very different relationship to communication devices, where a phone was a household appliance, not a personal device. And that if you missed that call, you missed it. If you didn't pick up the phone during the conversation at the dinner table, you missed the call. And so I think it's very easy for younger generations to get annoyed at older generations for how reactive they are to technology. Like, the classic would be the grandparent gets a ping and they need to look at the phone right away because they're worried that they're going to miss that ping, and it's actually just the grocery store giving them an offer or something. And that younger people, interestingly, tend to be better at ignoring those types of notifications. It's really important that I think we address this with kindness, that we need to remember that not only did they never have any kind of digital literacy education, of course, but also that the role of the phone and the role of communication devices were entirely different, and that the way that they were taught to use them was very different for a very different time.
Hmm. You mentioned digital literacy education in your book. Can you tell our listeners what's your idea of that, and when is it a good idea for us to start introducing those ideas around digital literacy?
Yeah, so I use the term digital literacy, but I should contextualize this in that often when schools talk about digital literacy, they're kind of using it as we would have 10 years ago, which was digital literacy is required because we need to teach kids how to use a computer, and we have to teach them how to use an iPad. I don't think we need to do that anymore. I think they're doing a really good job of that on their own. When I talk about digital literacy, or what some refer to as AI literacy, and more laterally, a lot of my work is looking at algorithmic literacy. I'm interested in teaching people not how to use technology, but how the technology functions, and specifically how it functions on them in order to manipulate them. And that is a really key thing to distinguish. And it's something I think we should be doing more and more. So when I talk about algorithmic literacy, I'm literally talking about how an algorithm works and what it does. And I think that this should start really early. I mean, I have very young kids. One's still a toddler. And I talk about not only what an algorithm is to them in a very simplistic way, but also what constitutes as relatively healthy screen engagement versus unhealthy screen engagement. And that's something we should be doing from a very early age. For too long, we have depended on screen time guidance, and that is the limiting the dosage of screen consumption to about 1 to 2 hours a day. And that guidance was based on some very good research on childhood obesity and diabetes. And so what screen time was based on is if a kid is sitting in front of a screen all the time, they are not physically moving around, and that is bad for their physical health, which is still true. That is correct. But what that guidance never addressed and never sought to address, it wasn't the point of it, was mental health and mental health well-being. And so screen time is about the quantity of time spent on screens, but not the quality of time spent on screens. And I'm really interested in talking about the quality of screen engagement. And so, and I say that, and in saying this, I should say, generally, time off screens is better than time on screens. For sure. That goes without saying. But if you are going to use a screen, not all screen time is equal. So, for example, by that old screen time guidance, you could have 2 kids of the same age having 1 hour screen time a day, and one kid could be sitting with a parent doing engaged viewing. That means you're stopping for breaks, you're having conversations, you could be watching a David Attenborough documentary and having discussions, doing something called collective or interactive viewing. And you could have another kid alone in the room with a set of headphones on, scrolling through an algorithmically driven feed on an iPad. And by that old screen time guidance, that would, be counted as the same. But of course, it's not the same. Those are 2 very, very different experiences. And so what we're trying to do when we talk about qualitative screen consumption is we're trying to, first of all, engage in active form of consumption. So consumption that is using brain function, that is inspiring creativity, that is inspiring communication. Generally, I would like to see it on a regulated space. And by a regulated space, I mean that I am a big fan of terrestrial TV. I'm a big fan of TVO. I think that Sesame Street is a good thing. And so much really important advocacy went in to children's programming and the rules around children's programming and what children's programming should be in the 1970s that have essentially been thrown out the window because kids aren't on those spaces anymore, because kids are on digitally driven feeds. Either they're on YouTube, and we know that in the US, from the age of 5, 89% of kids are on YouTube, 81% from the age of 3. So most kids are on YouTube. And if they're not, they are on algorithmically, they're still on digital services. So you're watching kind of 8 episodes of Bluey in a row, which isn't terrible. It's still made for kids. It's still, but it's not being programmed by a children's commissioner. It's not being thought through in those ways. So I think where we can find regulated spaces, where we can find interactive forms of viewing, where we can find ways for us all, not just kids, us all, to have much more engaged forms of viewing that inspire creativity and brain function, that is a good thing. And that's something worth striving for.
Great. If there were 3 messages that you wanted readers and our audience members to take away from your book, what would be the 3 big takeaways?
So the first, I think, is that you don't have to be a passive product. You can be an active participant. The second would be that we can be much more intentional about our usage. And the final one is a collective wish. It's that we can decide. We can decide that we want more, that we want more than our eyeballs and our children's eyeballs hooked on screens at any cost. And ultimately, policy follows the public will. And if enough of us demand a change, change is possible.
Amazing. Thank you so much. The book is Smartphone Nation, Why We're All Addicted to Our Screens and What You and Your Family Can Do About It by Dr. Kaitlyn Regehr. Thank you so much. Go get the book. It's incredible. I've learned so much about screen time from it. And I'm not surprised it's a national bestseller. Amazing. Thank you so much.